Welcome to our virtual Gallier gathering. We are the Hermann-Grima and Gallier historic houses. I'm Dr. Anastasia Scott. I have the title here of Director of Educational Programming. Gallier gatherings are being offered to you for free in this virtual platform. If you like our programming, please consider becoming a member. Membership has its perks. If you are not a Louisiana resident, you can take advantage of our North American Reciprocal Museum Association, where you can receive reciprocal museum benefits with museums and cultural institutions across the United States, Canada, Bermuda, El Salvador, and Mexico. Membership also helps with sponsoring programs such as this. If you join now, your membership is good through the end of June 2021. If you are impacted by COVID-19, we are offering student membership for $25 a year. You are also able to access our self-guided courtyard tour now and be able to tour both houses once it is safe to do so. We will soon have our exchange gift shop online. Please stay tuned for updates on our social media pages and website. Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, managed by the Women's Exchange, aims to preserve and maintain the architecture and decorative arts of the homes so they may act as a microcosm of life during the 19th and 20th centuries to inspire educational experiences and discourse around our collective past and its contribution to the culture of New Orleans. For his talk, Whisky, Boxing, and Politics, the Lost New Orleans of Big Jim Comiskey, Dr. Justin Nistrom will explore the life and times of one of New Orleans's larger-than-life figures of the 20th century, Big Jim James Kaminsky. Justin A. Nistrom is the Peter J. Cangelosi Begars Distinguished Professor in the History Department at Loyola University, New Orleans. He is the author of New Orleans After the Civil War, Race, Politics, and a New Birth of Freedom, and Creole Italian, Sicilian Immigrants and the Shaping of New Orleans Food Culture, which was nominated for the 2019 James Beard Foundation Award in the Scholarship and Reference category. At Loyola, Nistrom teaches Southern history, Civil War and Reconstruction, New Orleans history, foodways, documentary and oral history, and the historiography seminar. He also regularly teaches in Loyola's innovative interdisciplinary first-year seminar program, most recently offering a course titled History on the New Orleans Landscape. He is the founding director of the Documentary and Oral History Studio, which he founded as a unit of the History Department in 2012. So, without further ado, I present to you Dr. Justin A. Nistrom.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. I hope everybody is happily at home in their pajamas, enjoying this talk. It's a shame we can't be in the French Quarter right now. When I was talking to Anastasia a couple of weeks ago, we were thinking that I would be in the building itself, in the stables. And so if you've not been to the Hermann-Grima house, it's this really great, one of my favorite things in the French Quarter are the stables, where it's one of the few places in the French Quarter where you can see this really interesting leftover of the very substantial equine history in the French Quarter where everybody used to have horses. But be that as it may, we're doing what we can. And thank you so much for, I guess, tuning in tonight for my talk. So Big Jim Comiskey kind of came to my attention almost incidentally. I didn't grow up in New Orleans, and I mean, Jim Comiskey would have died when I was 2 years old anyway, so I'm not sure, even if I had grown up in New Orleans, I would have had any kind of conscious memory of him. But I had, over the years, particularly in doing the research for Creole Italian, I spent a lot of time working with old newspapers as just part of my job, and you would see these ads for Old Comiskey whiskey, and they would always be kind of interesting. They would attract your eye. They were definitely here, and certainly I'd go to Dornat's or something like that, and I'd see Old Comiskey mixers in the liquor area, and so I was aware of the brand. And then I did some oral histories for Creole Italian, and also some oral histories with my friend Jack Davis of political figures in New Orleans. And every now and then Jim Comiskey would come up for the restaurateurs, and who would talk about going down to the the warehouse at 100 Common Street to buy alcohol, or because it was a big distributorship. Or I remember particularly one time interviewing Jimmy Fitzmaurice, former lieutenant governor, and he's of that generation, one of the sort of surviving people of that generation, and he was talking a little bit about Big Jim Comiskey. But it wasn't until Rouse's grocery store, they have that magazine, Rouse's Everyday, they asked me to write an article for their bourbon issue, and I was like, well, what about writing about Old Comiskey whiskey? Surely there's a lot to be found out about that. And so the editor said, fine, go ahead and do it. And I ended up going down the rabbit hole of Big Jim Comiskey and finding this guy who was really very interesting. And one of the things that really amazed me is that, some of the people in the audience may be of an age where maybe they even remember going in to see Jim Comiskey in his later years as tax assessor in the first district tax assessor. Or perhaps maybe they remember the whiskey on the shelf. Both of these things would have disappeared in the early 70s. But one thing really stood out to me was Jim Comiskey almost doesn't even exist on the internet. He does now because I wrote that story, but you Google it, you can't find an image of a whiskey bottle. It's like, and one of the things that's really, you try to impress upon college students is that, Google is good and it's powerful, but there's an awful lot more that you have to engage in if you want to really call it research. And so I knew Jim Comiskey was important. And so, I had to really engage in this sort of this methodology of the historian. Ultimately, I found a really good undergraduate thesis written in 1973 by a man who works as an attorney today in Houston. And but in 1973, he was an undergraduate at Tulane. And I also found a 1969 New Orleans Magazine article written by Hope May, who some of you may remember was a journalist with the State's Item for many, many years, probably most famous in his journalism looking into the JFK investigation. So those two gave me a toehold, but what I really had to do was methodologically very much like what I'd done in the two books that I've written, is what I call fragment gathering. When people leave behind little bits and pieces of their lives in the historical record, and you kind of got to take these bits and pieces and knit them together into a story. And that's what I had to do with the really interesting outside life of Big Jim Comiskey, that had all these really interesting dimensions. And one of the things that became clear to me was that Jim Comiskey was in many ways a metaphor for 20th century New Orleans up until like the 70s, when New Orleans started changing quite a bit. He's born at the very end of the 19th century in 1897, and then in the 20s and 30s, he's from the blue collar neighborhood of Mid City, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Mid City. But his life really is not only reflective of New Orleans in that time period, it's very much reflective of a New Orleans that no longer exists, because a lot of the kinds of things that made Comiskey who he was and what he represented aren't things you see in New Orleans anymore. And so I want to kind of like unpack his life, and hope in doing so take you on a journey of what New Orleans was like in this very different time. Um, we tend to talk a lot about in New Orleans history. We tend to talk about the 19th century, and you know, the 19th century really super interesting. We spend a lot less time talking about the 20th century in New Orleans. Um, and partly because I think we perceive our audience as less interested in it. But the 20th century, of course, is a really interesting and dynamic time in New Orleans' history. And again, Comiskey is very symbolic of it. And the first thing I want to share is actually a map. I put together a Google map. Let me see if I find it here. Oh, goodness. Now all of a sudden, I am looking for my map. This is what I have to do. I am going to stop here and go back to Zoom, share screen. Bear with me, this is going to be more seamless with the rest of the images, I promise. So I put together this map, and it is a map of Jim Kaminsky City. And I'm going to be coming back to this map periodically. But Jim Kaminsky's born right here at 2713 Bank Street, again, right near the intersection of Tulane and Broad. So much of what happens in Jim Kaminsky's life occurs near the intersection of Tulane and Broad. And of course, when you say that today, people are like, oh, the criminal court building. But there's a reason why the criminal court building was built where it was, is because this was a very blue collar area. In 1897, this part of Mid-City was really kind of new. It was just being built. It was heavily populated by immigrants, children of immigrants, a lot of Irish, a lot of Italians, and also a lot of African Americans who had migrated to the city from places like rural Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas, because New Orleans is attracting a lot of people at this time still. New Orleans is still very much a growing city with all kinds of folks showing up there. And this part of Mid-City is, again, it's very industrial. Remember, the canal, which today, of course, is the Lafitte Greenway, is still a functioning canal going down to the basin in the year that Jim Kaminsky is born. Right over here where the United States Post Office is, that is a major railroad depot, rail yard. And then, of course, at that time, Earhart Boulevard was a major track of the Illinois Central. And then it doesn't run the same way, but where Poydras Street is today, Poydras was a very industrial area at the time. And that sort of little cutoff of Poydras Street over there today is like this little remnant of that world. Of course, you have the brewery, the Falstaff condominiums are there today. Like, this is a very blue collar, oyster shell roads. Nothing's paved hardly except for Tulane Avenue and Broad. A lot of industry that you can still see little hints of if you drive around in this area behind Falstaff. It's still fairly industrial. And this is the world that Jim Kaminsky grew up in. His dad had been a sheriff's deputy and worked at the jail, was often involved in things like gambling and whatnot. He was very, kind of the stereotypical Irish immigrant, kind of tough guy. And Jim Kaminsky grows up in this very masculine world. His mother dies rather tragically on Easter Sunday in 1906 when Jim Kaminsky is 9 years old. And I was not able to ascertain from the sources what the accident was that killed her. But he goes and lives with his aunt, Virginia Casserly, who is actually in 1910, she's the head of NORD, the New Orleans Recreational Department, and which is very unusual for a woman. She was a suffragette. She had once chained herself to the fence of the White House in a suffrage protest. So he was around these really strong personalities who were politically involved, and again, all in this neighborhood. So there's this theme of these kind of tough political people. But another theme that runs through his life is athletics. Jim Kaminsky is always kind of the consummate athlete. And being a tough kid from a tough neighborhood, this was, you know, something that would have been not uncommon. I want to share some other images here. Here we go. So this is Kempster Park, which no longer exists today. It's on Canal Street. I'm going to go ahead and hide these thumbnails right now. This is a picture taken probably in the 1930s. It's been electrified. It's a really great image. And this is right next to Warren Easton High School, where Jim Kaminsky would have attended high school. And this was a baseball, obviously a baseball diamond, and was a scene of many of Jim Kaminsky's days as a youth. Today it's where the RTA has its bus barn and all this other stuff there is built on this site. But in 1915, there's an event, there's an incident that takes place that in many ways is very symbolic of where young Jim Kaminsky is, and the sort of kind of rough and tough place that New Orleans is in 1915 in these blue-collar areas. So his father is playing dice at Kempster Park with a guy named Henry Nagel. And they get into a big argument, and Henry Nagel threatens the father, and he's like, well, you wouldn't talk to me like that if my son was here. And, you know, Jim Kaminsky would have been about 18 years old at the time, and was, you know, apparently like the reputation as kind of a tough guy. And so he shows up, he's there, you know, the son's there. And then all of a sudden Nagel and the senior Kaminsky are betting on a fight, a bare knuckle fight. And they're like, younger Jim Kaminsky was saying, I tried to get them to call off the bet, but father was laying 3-1 on neither side would stand down. And so like they're betting on this fight. They go from betting on dice to going to betting on this fist fight. And then, you know, very large. And so in Kaminsky's later words, a very large crowd gathered, and we walked around looking for a place to fight. Finally, we settled on second base. So you have these two men doing this bare knuckle fight, and Kaminsky knocks the guy out, knocks him out cold, and, you know, it does a 10 count. And the Henry Nagel, of course, later becomes a political ally of Big Jim Kaminsky. And it was just kind of very symbolic. And of course, so you can imagine here at Kempster Park, you know, right at second base, this scene unfolding. Kaminsky had been, his first love was baseball. He wanted to be a big leaguer, and he had been a minor leaguer. So in this time period in the teens, remember, radio's not really invented until 1920, and it takes a little while. One of the things that fuels the consumer revolution in the 1920s is people going out and buying radios, which were very expensive, and people would buy them on credit because they were so expensive. The first baseball game is broadcast in 1921, and, you know, it takes a while. Ultimately, the World Series, I forget what year the World Series is first broadcast, syndicated on the radio. It takes a while for these radio syndications to become widespread. So local baseball was really big. And so Big Jim Kaminsky played for what was called the Cotton States League, and he played in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, but apparently he couldn't hit good big league pitching, which of course is one of the things that always divides the pros from the minors. Often is the ability to hit big league pitching, but apparently Kaminsky was quite a good fielder and could pitch as well. But he comes back to New Orleans, and in 1920 he's back living with his dad. Go ahead and put my images back up. And in the 1920 census, we see him down here. James Kaminsky is head of household. His wife Viola, he's remarried. Jim Kaminsky's younger son Lawrence, who will be his running mate for a long time, and of course here we are. Sorry for the scrolling. He's the deputy sheriff at the parish prison, and Big Jim is working as a government clerk, so he's still able to work his connections in and amongst the various political connections that his dad has. But getting back to the map, I'm going back and forth a lot. One of the things that, so there's Warren Easton High School, where he most goes. There's Kempster Park. Now seeing the RTA, we see these things are all really, really close by. Like you could walk the world of Big Jim Comiskey in a half an hour. You know, it was all really super close by. But at 2654 so he's living there on Bank Street, again, 2 blocks, not even from where he's born. I skipped it, 2901 Tulane Avenue. Something really important happens. In 1924, he's not quite 30 years old. Big Jim Comiskey opens his Green Onion Saloon. And you say, why, that's the middle of Prohibition. And in fact, yes, it is in fact the middle of Prohibition. The Green Onion Saloon is an interesting place. And in his own words, Kaminsky referred to as, that saloon was an all-night affair, he told a reporter, and he told this to Hope May in 1969. He said, I met a lot of people and I began signing bail bonds out of friendship and courtesy. I guess I signed $1 million worth of bonds and I never made 5 cents in my life from it. Well, maybe, and it seemed the natural thing to do, and I made a lot of friends, and he did make a lot of friends. I mean, there's this sociological concept called the third place. There's, your home, there's your work, and then there's these places where people socialize. And the third place is a very important thing in the 1920s, in bars and saloons, and they remain so. I mean, I think that's one of the things under quarantine right now is it's deprived many of us of our third place, and frankly, a number of us of our second place as well. And so these saloons were, of course, very masculine. This would have been all men. They're very political. Gambling is a foregone conclusion. And Kaminsky also at the same time remains involved in athletics. He's in the saloon business. He's in he becomes a professional baseball. He becomes a professional baseball umpire at Kempster Park. But the Green Onion Saloon is it's a tough working men's bar, and sort of emblematic of that is, of course, some of the things that unfold there. Now, Jim and his younger brother Lawrence are arrested in 1924 for violating the Volstead Act, and I want to say that's like small potatoes, but it's small potatoes. Everybody and their cat's getting arrested for violating the Volstead Act. And really not until 1926 when the feds get involved does it become serious. Every now and then before then, I mean, the police were very complicit in the running of they were in cooperation with the saloons and so forth. But something a little more serious occurred in 1925. So there was a competing, and I love the name of it, the competing soft drink saloon called the Quiet Spot, which gets burned to the ground. I guess it becomes a very quiet spot. And so the fire marshal shows up, and Jim Kaminsky and his dad are in the burned out bar along with an unnamed relative when the fire marshal shows up, and the fire marshal tells them to, get out of there. And they're like, no, we're not going anywhere. And they start fighting with the fire marshal, a couple of cops there. And the unnamed relative steals the police officer's gun and starts beating him with it. Cops run off and he shoots at him. I mean, this is pretty serious stuff. And later on, they're basically fined $100. This is a pretty, on the first blush of it would be a pretty serious offense. I can't imagine today getting off with $100 fine for doing something like this. I don't know, no matter who you're connected to, but it was very emblematic of the sort of, ties between this world of gambling and sports and alcohol and the police the police department, and say, well, this is sort of endemic of the corruption of that time period, and it is. It's very symbolic of how things work. The NOPD the next year go and there's a sweep. I'll get there. Of gambling. Every now and then the state officials would get very concerned about vice in New Orleans, and they'd make a big show about doing something, and then they'd mollify the state, and then things would kind of go back to normal. And that's very much how New Orleans operated for a very great portion excuse me. Let me mute this real quick. For a very big portion of the 20th century. So the quiet spot is this really, I would say, kind of humorous instance. Another thing that that Kaminsky's doing a lot of getting into is, of course, is boxing. So in 1928, Kaminsky starts the Third Ward Athletic Club, and I show you on the map, but it's essentially right across from the courthouse on Broad Street. I love these pictures of these boxers from the 20s with their high-waisted shorts. They're always these like scrappy Italian kids, or occasionally most of the New Orleans boxers are Italian, and it's really hard to overestimate how popular boxing was in New Orleans in the 20s through, say, 1960, and even into the 60s. But really, like the 20s, 30s, 40s, even into the 50s, that's really the heyday of boxing in New Orleans. New Orleans produces a number of champions. And again, boxing is, one of those really blue-collar immigrant, like today, it's blue-collar kids, it's immigrant kids, a lot of Latinos who are involved in boxing. Boxing's really big in Latin America. It remains so. Most of the boxers are African Americans. We've seen mixed martial arts kind of come into the fore in a big way, and in some ways eclipse boxing in our own time. But like boxing still is very much associated with the tough kid from the city who goes and they fight their way to the top. And so boxing as a spectator sport, again, is a really big deal in the you think about like the big Max Schmeling, Joe Louis fights in Yankee Stadium. And this is occurring on a smaller scale, but if you could imagine a 2,000-seat outdoor arena across from, so the courthouse isn't built yet. The courthouse is in the process of being built when these fights are going on. So you could go and take the streetcar up Tulane Avenue to Broad and get off at Tulane and Broad off the Tulane Avenue streetcar and walk over to the fight. And of course, again, one of the things I really, just to go back to that Kempster Park photograph, is you kind of imagine these lights at night on a fall evening and these men in the ring illuminated, and all these, it's going to be overwhelmingly men at the fight. And it's just really, again, this really masculine space, and how many pint bottles of bootleg whiskey are being sold, and the tobacco, and just the sounds of the scene. And again, this is another one of those things that puts Comiskey in the center of things. And of course, you can't talk about gambling, or rather boxing, without talking about gambling. And again, when I talk about how the state would come in, and you got to love the humor of 1920s, 30s newspaper writing, where they refer to the people who arrest, and the pair that are being arrested are Jim Comiskey and his father, the sleuths. Like it took a sleuth to find people gambling in New Orleans, but you would have these periodic sweeps in New Orleans, driven by state pressures to clean up gambling in the big city. But this was also political. And it shows the growing involvement of Big Jim Comiskey in politics, because this is a sweep driven by Huey Long's government. We see in the late 20s, Big Jim Comiskey gets brought in as kind of a rising star of the regular Democratic organization. He's got the Green Onion Saloon. He's doing the fights. He's writing these bail bonds. Of course, he's right near the criminal court building. He's somebody who's doing people lots of favors. He knows lots of people. He's very popular as a person. And he's going to be the kind of guy that helps the regular Democratic organization get out the vote. And the RDO eventually gets into an agreement, if you will, with the Long Machine. But in 1930, they hadn't yet come into that agreement where ultimately you get Maestri more or less as an appointed mayor. And then, of course, the RDO and the Long Machine are very much working in concert until, of course, until the election of Shep Morrison in 1946, and then everything's a little bit different. But in the midst of this, in 1932, Big Jim Comiskey becomes the candidate for the first municipal district tax assessor under our old system of 7 tax assessors. And this is really where Big Jim cements his role as a political figure. He's not a ward boss yet, which is he will be later on in the 40s. But as tax assessor, he's going to wield an enormous amount of power to help people, as he likes to put it, in his work. So, right around the 1930s, early 30s, things really start to take off for Jim Comiskey. In 32, he wins the election. So in 1933, this Franklin Roosevelt year, he takes office. But of course, in 1933, one of the first things that Franklin Roosevelt does is repeal prohibition. And, it's not like Jim Comiskey isn't already in the liquor business. And so this is very true for a lot of people in the liquor business. Restaurateurs, bootleggers, bar owners, things like that, they were all lining up to get their license to manufacture and distribute alcohol. And there's a guy by the name of Harry Scott who's from Kentucky, and he goes and, according to Comiskey, some of these older oral histories done in 1972, right before his death, he said, well, he said, I really needed a side business, that politics wasn't enough. You needed a sideline. And so he got into the liquor business in a legal way and creates the L&J distributorship. And so it's a big warehouse. Let me go ahead and share a screen here. That's located ultimately on Common Street. Let's share this. And one of the things that's really kind of amazing to me is I had the darndest time finding a good picture of this warehouse of L&J distributing at 100 Common Street. It's like right down. This is, of course, the White League Monument. I bought this photograph on eBay because it was described as a billboard that said Comiskey, and the seller had no idea where the photograph was taken. I'm like, well, I know where that photograph was taken. It was taken right on the foot of Canal Street. I think I paid $8 for this photograph. And so, of course, we zoom in a little bit on it, and we can see 3 Feathers. This is probably from the late 40s. This is 3 Feathers was a whiskey that L&J distributed out of this warehouse. There were a couple of different liquor distributors along this area of Common Street. If you went further to the right, there would be the big Dr. Tinkner sign, which when I interviewed a bunch of old longshoremen, they would say that you would go and wait under the Dr. Tinkner sign to get hired for your jobs as longshoremen, because they were hired by the ship back when there were 150 different shipping companies in New Orleans. And so the whiskey is actually made at the K. Taylor Distilling Company, and there's this really great postcard. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of driving around this part of Kentucky. It is actually very beautiful. The limestone hills right along kind of the Kentucky River and areas like that. I had reason to be up there once a year for a stretch of my time in the summer, and I really enjoyed it. But the K. Taylor Distilling Company is, built new after the repeal of Prohibition, and they start bottling for Jim Comiskey, his brand. So let's see here. I don't have the image. So one thing about whiskey is that, pivoting to whiskey here for a minute, there's no good whiskey to be had in 1935 unless you drink imported whiskey. I had an image in my folder, but it must not be showing. But it's an ad for Thanksgiving from Solari's Grocery. Some of you may remember, of course, the fabled Solari's Grocery, which there's certainly no equivalent of today. And they were advertising, this whiskey. And at the time in 1937, Comiskey's Old Comiskey whiskey really first appears in late 1935. I think it's an 18-month-old whiskey, which had to be unbelievably green. And then as time goes by, so by Thanksgiving of 1937, it's a 2-year-old whiskey, which again is unbelievably green. But then you realize in the Solari's ad that the up-brand whiskey next to it is 30 months old. So, when you're measuring the aging in whiskey in these very, very short time periods, you realize that it's an industry rebuilding itself. And Comiskey whiskey is part of that. There are a bunch of these brands that sort of appear overnight. It was a private label. Ultimately, Comiskey will be the largest private label brand in the region, in the South, which is a pretty big deal. Of course, New Orleans is a big market for it, obviously, but the Comiskey whiskey grows, and over time, of course, it becomes, let me go ahead and share this. I keep going to my image before I go to my share button. I'll have to do better, endeavor to do better. So here we are in I believe this is 1939. Old Comiskey is 4 years old now. It's progressively getting older, and I really love this photograph. Let's see if my children bust up on me here in a minute. I hear them in the other room. They're getting near. This is a really great photograph. These guys, I searched high and low to identify these people, but you cannot tell me these aren't boxers. These guys are totally boxers. My feeling is that the guy on the left is the manager. I know the guy on the far right standing is with the steamboat. This is taken on the Steamboat Capital, and they're holding 4-year-old bottles of Old Comiskey whiskey. So we can positively date this photograph to 1939, because next year Old Comiskey whiskey is 5 years old, and they are very proud of that fact. So this photograph taken in 1939, I'm guessing of these boxers. This is on the Capitol, which is an excursion steamer. It was very popular, certainly before World War II. Really, the 30s is the tail end of this world, where you'd have excursion steamers coming to New Orleans from pretty far away. And this one, it was based, I believe, out of St. Louis. And they would come down, and they'd come down from Mardi Gras for sure. But they would also, do things like prize fights. And I'm guessing this is a promotional photo. My feeling is Comiskey may be sponsoring this fight. I really wanted to find evidence. of that fact. So all this is a guess, but God, I love that photograph. They look like they're having a good time. And my guess is these two gentlemen are going to be beating each other's brains out in the ring in a matter of weeks after this photograph is taken. But Comiskey over time, again, like I said, old Comiskey is now 5 years old. The South's largest selling private brand celebrates its 5th whiskey. So you can see that, really in a short period of time, Comiskey has been able to build this whiskey business into, a really quite thriving thing. And into the 40s, I love these ads. The Lions, so you had in the 40s, again, we start to see more. Conventions would come to New Orleans, like conventions have been coming to New Orleans for, 140 years when, going back to things like Confederate veterans reunions in the late 19th century, but also businessmen's associations. It was very popular in the 1900s and the teens for different groups to start coming to New Orleans for their conventions when it was a little cooler out. So that convention business has been around a lot. And in this case, the International Lions Club was coming to New Orleans. There's a big full page in the newspaper. And of course, when the Lions are frisky, which is frankly a proposition I don't want to think about, but when the Lions are frisky, they drink Old Comiskey, and I love it. And we start to see pictures of James Comiskey, the president. I struggled to find a good photograph of him from this time period when his hair was still this dark black, but here we are. And of course, over time, his face will end up on the label. And here he is again, James E. Comiskey, the president, talking about patriotic whiskey. One of the things that I wanted to note here is, of course, here there's a lot of question whether we're going to have Mardi Gras during 2021. And it is worth noting that during World War II, this ad's from 1942, there was no carnival in 1942, 43, 44, or 45, at least public parades. There were balls, but we have this little patriotic cartouche in the corner, let's make Carnival Day Bond and Stamp Day, which I think is a great little piece of that historical moment. And just a little bit more about the whiskey. So if you lived in New Orleans long enough, and I've certainly lived in New Orleans long enough, you know people who wax about being able to go to Schwegmann's. And not just being able to go to Schwegmann's, but go there and get snookered while you were grocery shopping. And so this is an ad from 1961. So, 20 years later, I could give you I have a very large collection of Comiskey ads from the 40s and 50s that I sifted through. But I really like this one, the Mardi Gras Day Special. So for $0.25, you could go to Schwegmann's and get a highball of Old Comiskey whiskey and then kind of weave through the aisles with your whiskey while you're grocery shopping, which honestly, under pandemic, if you didn't have to wear your mask and you could actually drink, would make it a lot less stressful, particularly in those early days of the pandemic. But, and again, I keep touching on this, with all apologies to Benny Grunch and the Bunch. This is, again, one of those things that ain't there no more. And Schwegmann's definitely falls in that category. But the idea of going and the sort of liquor culture of New Orleans, this very different way, the different feel. I mean, people drink in New Orleans certainly today, and they drink to excess, and they drink at the damnedest times. But there's a different level. This is like your mom and them going drinking at the grocery store. This is a different sort of, going to the grocery store after mass or something and, having a highball. Different people would do different things. And so very much a part of New Orleans that, I mean, in some ways sort of surprised grocery stores don't bring this back, but like something that's gone, in a way that this rest of this world, it has disappeared. Oh, zoom out here in a minute. I'm going to stop sharing. So politically, in the 40s, as his whiskey business flourished, Comiskey was a savvy guy. There were a couple of things that he did that were really smart. One of them was in 1948, when the rest of the South was getting all really excited about voting for Strom Thurmond. Comiskey was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, and he supported Harry Truman. Of course, Harry Truman won. So Comiskey was one of the first people consulted when it came to patronage jobs. He was somebody in the state of Louisiana who very much stood with Truman and was repaid for that loyalty. The other thing is that like he really starts building his following. He doesn't have the Green Onion Saloon anymore once he becomes a liquor distributor. But what he does when he becomes tax assessor is he creates what he calls his field office on Bank Street. So, again, we go to the map, and I may have to call my spouse in here because I see my laptop battery is down to 26%. So I will hopefully not run out of battery. But if we go to the map, we can again see 528 South Broad, his boxing club. 118 South Broad, his first field office. Those of you in New Orleans today will recognize this as, well, it gets demolished to become the Whitney Bank, which today is the Family Dollar at Broad and Canal. That modern building, of course, was the Family Dollar is not known for spending money on architecture. That building was built for the Whitney, which abandoned it at some point in the 80s. And then he moves it down the street over here to 441 South Jefferson Davis Parkway. And so this was what he called the branch office. And of his so what would happen is on every Wednesday actually, all day, every Wednesday. I think the only time he didn't do it was when Christmas fell on a Wednesday, literally. And so there would be a sign in there, and it said, all matters pertaining to tax assessments, real and personal, can be discussed here at our field office every Wednesday from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. with James E. Comiskey, tax assessor. And so what you'd have is like this open door policy. You'd go in, you'd check in with the receptionist. There'd be a bunch of benches in there, not any backs on them, so you couldn't lounge around too much. Comiskey would be up there. And in later years, the BBC in the late 60s goes and seeks this guy out because he's doing this into the late 60s. And this is very much a holdover of old city machine politics of a different generation. And in the late 60s, he's seen as kind of the last of this breed who's still doing this kind of bread and butter meeting your constituent politics. And so people would come in there and they might have a beef about their tax assessment. And his district included, of course, also all the businesses on Canal Street. So like he wielded a lot of power over assessments for pretty significant property holders, as well as his district, which was full of blue collar people who were just like him. He was of that neighborhood. And so like he understood these people. And over the years, as the neighborhood became more and more African American, that was who his constituency was, and they would come in and see them, and like people would come in if I really need a job, he would be the guy to see. He would even fix things in Jefferson Parish because he knew everybody. So if you could come in and see old Big Jim Comiskey, you wouldn't go in just to see your tax assessment adjusted. you would go in for all manner of things, much more so than you would to a city council person, you know. So Comiskey does this until he dies in 1972. He has his son, James A. Comiskey, who is, I have this photograph again through the miracle of eBay. I was astonished to find that somebody had gotten a hold of all the States Item press photos and was selling them on eBay. And I found this photograph, and this is taken in 1961. The son, this is when he was filling a term on the New Orleans City Council. And his son ran unsuccessfully in the primary against Vic Schiro in 64, 65, I forget the year of that race, and did not become mayor, but ultimately became a federal judge. And so the son, of course, went on to, have a pretty significant career as a lawyer and a political figure, rather than, his blue collar dad who had a high school education, and so here he is with his parents at a luncheon. His photo's been retouched by somebody with an airbrush. And so, here's a picture of Big Jim Comiskey in his office, but you could kind of imagine him sitting there in the branch office listening to things, or not listening, because he was deaf, of course, by the time the late 60s come around. And his nephew, Lawrence Comiskey, would be there and would basically listen to whatever the person brought in and then write it down for his uncle. And then he'd very clearly say, oh, this person should go see so-and-so in this office. And they'll, he'd write something down, and basically he took care of it, an old-fashioned fixer. But the world of Jim Comiskey ends. Of course, he dies in 1972. Here's a label of one of his, this was actually in the master's thesis. I don't know if the undergraduate, had to do research and bought a bottle of whiskey for the label, really, just for research purposes, or not. But the whiskey brand disappears not long after Comiskey himself, but the whole world disappears. The assessorship, I believe, goes to his nephew. It kind of stays in the family. That was sort of a New Orleans thing for a very long time, these assessor positions. But it ends up becoming, when Bold comes along, it's escaping me, the name, Bold, Black Organization of Leadership Development. You have these, Black political empowerment that really starts occurring in the 1970s, right as Comiskey dies. And ultimately, an African-American unseats, this RDO candidate in this assessor's office. And ultimately, a Bold candidate will hold that position until 2010, when miraculously we reduce our 7 assessor system to 1 assessor. And so in many ways that was a big part of the Katrina political paradigm shift that we saw. But really the 70s usher in a new reality for New Orleans. New Orleans is changing very rapidly in terms of demographics. It's shrinking in terms of population. The old political machines are no longer, and really even old Comiskey whiskey is no longer, because the world has changed. There are all kinds of cheap whiskeys out there now. There's no real reason to buy old Comiskey brand whiskey. And of course, the chieftain is no longer there running the operation either. I believe the distributorship gets sold, and they get out of liquor business. I would have to, somebody could confirm that. Maybe there's a family member in the audience who can confirm that. But that really, in many ways, ended this really interesting era of sports, of whiskey, of politics, of gambling, in these ward politics where you were much closer. You were much closer to the action. And you say, well, you know, that was kind of like an old corrupt system, but I'll leave to others whether that worked any less effectively than what we have now. I will leave that to the audience to decide. Obviously, today we have distilling right here happening in New Orleans. It's expensive, it's craft, you know. New Orleans is very different today. And I don't know if an old school guy like Big Jim Comiskey would even recognize it. But that was his world. And I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. So just take a minute or so if you'd like to plug in your computer.
I'm going to run and get my charger real quick.
Yeah.
Be right back.
Simultaneously, you all can start submitting your questions. Okay. You all can start submitting your questions to the chat. I'll give you some time to, you know, reflect while he charges his.
I didn't realize yours wasn't in there.
While Dr. Nistrom charges his computer. I see that we do have several of the Kaminsky family members on. This is so exciting. I'll start there. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you all joined. I feel like it's a family affair for you all. Okay, I'll let him know. Yes, the recording will be available. We are recording this and it will be available. So I'll just, when he comes back, I'll start with the first question, and at any point, if you all have any additional questions, please use the chat feature and I'll answer them live. So just give me a moment to gather my question. I actually had a question. Let's see.
So a funny but true story. I was in graduate school, and I was a graduate assistant for I won't say who it was, but he was a prominent historian who was lecturing in a big 300-seat lecture hall with one of these wireless microphones. And during an exam or a quiz in the middle of the class, he decided he would head to the restroom, where his microphone continued working all through a fairly loud session in the stall. And he came back into the class, this 300-seat lecture hall, to a standing ovation. He was very, very embarrassed.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Nistrom.
Sorry.
We have several family members of Big Jim.
Great.
I want to sort of shout them out. We have Connie Kaminsky. We have Catherine Kaminsky Marsh. We have Victoria Roper. Big Jim Kaminsky was her great grandfather.
Oh, very cool.
So we have a lot of family members represented. I just wanted to point that out. And someone said, also we have Miss Laura Bell Kaminsky, Big Jim's only surviving child.
Oh, cool.
Viewing with us. And someone responded to your last question. The whiskey company was sold to the manager of Jack's Brewery.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll start with the first question. Okay. Many members of the Kaminsky family are watching this. Angelique LaCour, granddaughter, watching in Bates, St. Louis. Blanche Comiskey, wife of James A. Comiskey. Wow, thank you all. So happy.
I'm really happy. When I did that Rouse's article, I got emails from a number of people in the family, and that was very gratifying because he's a super interesting guy, right? You know, and it had this really colorful career as a politician and just kind of like very of New Orleans, you know.
Absolutely. So I guess I'll mix it up. I don't have to start with my question since we had enough time. So Andre Battencourt, hopefully I pronounced that right. Big Jip Kaminsky's great-great-grandson wants to know the name of the baseball team.
Okay, so he played on a bunch of different teams and he managed teams. So there was the one in Hattiesburg was like the Hubmen or something like that. And then he managed in 1928 at Kempster Park a team called the Parkways. There were all these like little, you know how like companies sponsor little league teams today? That was not uncommon for a company to sponsor like a grown-ups playing this sort of, not, I want to say semi-pro baseball, but there was a lot of that in New Orleans for sure.
Wow, thank you. Another question. Related to Comiskey Park in Chicago, is there any connection? So the home of the White Sox, is there any connection to Comiskey Park in Chicago?
I don't believe so unless somebody in the family knows differently. I think Big Jim would have been really super excited about that because I know his big dream as a young man, in his own words, was to play big league ball and, you know, play for the White Sox. It would have been a pretty big deal. But I mean, what's interesting is actually the owner of the White Sox had a lot in common. I mean, he was a political figure. He was in the liquor business where he made the money to have the baseball team. You know, he was also an Irishman, Irish descent, and so, you know, I don't know if they ever met, but I mean, they probably would have understood each other, would be my feeling. But I don't think there's any connection. I'm happy to be corrected on that.
Thank you. One of the relatives said that we are no relation to Comiskey Park.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
And then another question, what were some of the competing liquor distributors?
Oh, gosh. There were a bunch, and none of them are coming to mind. There was one it was an Italian name. It was it was I think it even shared part of that same building, even right there on Common Street. Frank Maselli, no, Joe Maselli. Joe Maselli had a big liquor distributorship starting in the 40s. He would have been somebody who would have also been in this. There were a bunch of liquor distributors in the area, but Comiskey was a pretty big player at one time. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question. Did Comiskey ever travel outside of NOLA to do business with elites in New York or DC?
That did not come up in what I've researched. I would guess he would have traveled, but he was very much anchored here for sure. So that can't answer that one.
Okay. And I think you touched upon it a little bit, but these are two related questions. It said, one says, could one see the ads and research collection that you have? And the second related question is, where did you get, in so many words, where did you get all of the photos?
Okay, so if you, those of you in the audience who do not have a library card with New Orleans Public Library should get one. To support your library, they're good people. Because when you have your library card, this entitles you. Now I have a university library as well, but actually the public library has, if you're interested in New Orleans history, you can, with your library card, go to the website and you can log in using your library card number. And there's a newspaper, historical newspaper database that you can access. It has, there are actually a couple, but there's a one by ProQuest that has the item, the states, and then states item when they're combined, and the Picayune. And you can search these. And it takes a little bit of, like, you can search these historical newspapers and like know that something's there specifically that you know is there and it not come up in the search. But it does return a lot of hits. And so if you want to go and find these ads, you'll find a lot of articles about Comiskey Park in Chicago if you put in Comiskey. But, you know, refining your search, you can definitely find a lot of these ads over time, starting in about 1936. You start to see little ads in 1936 and then bigger ones as time goes by.
Okay, thank you. Okay. How many kids did Jim Kaminsky have?
Oh my goodness. I don't know the answer to that question, but I know there are people in this audience who do.
Okay, next question. I'm pretty sure someone will answer it in the chat.
I see 4. So I see 4 from Laura Murphy.
Okay. Who did Kaminsky work with to create his advertisements?
I wish I knew that. Those are good things, weren't they? See, I told you the Q&A on this was going to be tough because there's a lot of people that are interested in this topic. Yeah.
Absolutely. So next question. Is the recipe for Old Comiskey whiskey available?
No. I mean, I don't know if any recipe for Old Comiskey whiskey. It was produced in Owensboro, Kentucky. It was that K. Taylor distillery first, and then it was produced by a company in Owensboro, and it's probably, so the way the whiskey business works is you, and actually this is even today more so. So there, you know how like today there are all these craft bourbons out there now. Seem like you go to the grocery store and there'd be another 5 different brands of bourbon. Most of these people don't actually distill their own bourbon. They get the green liquor from one of the biggies, you know, like a Labatt and Graham, or the people who do Maker's Mark.
Mm-hmm.
And then they age it themselves, or they flavor it. Like flavored whiskeys are all the big thing right now. Flavored, all kinds of stuff. Bill Goldring, he's like the genius of coming up with all these kinds of new brands. And so these sort of like real, like Old Comiskey wouldn't have been able to probably absorb the whole run of a major distillery, right? My guess is Old Comiskey would have tasted an awful lot like whiskeys of its type.
Okay.
Because it was it was like, you look at it, it was an affordable whiskey, right? It wasn't trying to be, but and again, like fancy bourbons are more of a thing of our time. Like, but by that I mean like in the last 40 years, like 50, 60 years ago, everybody drank Jim Beam. Or the equivalent of your basic Jim Beam. It was very rare to have a fancy bourbon then. So
Thank you. So next question. Out of all your research you did, if you had to choose one piece of history you learned about Big Jim Kaminsky's life, what was your personal favorite?
Well, I find saloon culture really interesting. So I think saloons, and like, if I could have transported myself back in time, I would have loved to seen a boxing match at the Third Ward Courthouse Boxing Club. That had to be amazing. You know, to see a New Orleans that really unchanged from the time we're in, and then to like these bars that were, you know, gathering places. I mean, bars are gathering places today, but like bars that had a real political dimension to them in the sort of machine politics sort of way. People talk politics in bars all the time, but it's not organized in that same sense. And so I find that the 20s and 30s to me in New Orleans are super interesting. I hope to someday write something that really gives the 20s and 30s in New Orleans their due. There isn't a ton of scholarship on that time period in New Orleans, but it's actually a time of incredible transformation in the city. So.
Thank you. I had a quick question about this idea of fragment gathering. So, as a historic house, the houses themselves are, sort of the artifact, if you would, on display. So we seek to preserve not only the house, but the decorative arts that in the houses. And part of part of the work that we do is expanding our education so that it is more inclusive. Mm-hmm. And so in many ways that we do a little bit of fragment gathering to take the little bits and pieces of some of the enslaved people that lived and worked in the homes over the years, and we have to take what little we do find to create a narrative around it. So could you talk a little bit more about that research process, and could it be applied to those who don't have sort of a lot of records, given the status of who they were in history?
Yeah, probably I'm going out on a limb here, but you probably have a lot of genealogists or people interested in genealogy in this audience. I know that to be the case usually when I give a talk at a historic house or something like that. And genealogists are really good at this sort of thing because they're by nature researching the lives of people who weren't necessarily famous. And so, to me, I tend not to write about famous people. And I was sort of surprised that there wasn't more. There is more about Jim Kaminsky. If I wanted to focus on my focus of what I was interested in, I was mostly interested in the bourbon. But if I wanted to focus a little bit more on the politics, I could have probably found a little bit more. And then also, I would have definitely tracked down like the family members, for instance. Again, this was something that I kind of wrote this little piece on, and it was super interesting. I'm like, when y'all asked me to do this, I was like, more people need to know about Big Jim Kaminsky because he's really interesting and he's really symbolic of New Orleans. But like, if I were going to write more about this, I'd want to sit down with family members and get that oral tradition, get those kinds of things that only a family member would. So like, if you're a genealogist, record those family histories when you can, because when somebody dies, it's like water going down a sewer drain. It's gone, So that's one of the reasons why I'm really into oral history, and I like, recording these kinds of stories. And I can't. You don't stop. Be like, oh, I don't have the right recorder. Oh, oh man, I don't have my question. Just do it. Just hit record on your phone and record it. And if you're not satisfied with the interview you get, you can go do it again. But in the meanwhile, things happen, life happens, and then it goes on and it's gone. So I can't stress enough, if you really think there's somebody whose stories are important, you should just go and today or tomorrow, but not the day after, record them, right? But so fragment gathering, when you go further back in time, in what I call beyond the cone of memory, I like to call it when I teach my historiography class, which is, so like one of the things I wrote about in Creole Italian was West End as it was before they filled in the lake and created the lakefront. No living person remembers dancing at West End. And, you know, it's beyond what people would know. So you have to do kind of a bank shot on memory. One of the things I really like working with, and I didn't use in this, I mean, I used some census sheets. Census is our bread and butter of genealogists, and they're very informative. Census sheets tell us, if you talk about enslaved people, slave censuses, in the enumeration can tell you things. But the real jackpot is when somebody ends up in court. If you get a lawsuit, a criminal court case, and it gets heard, especially if it gets heard by a state Supreme Court or an appeals court, you've got this record, and you've got, court documents have their own way you interpret them. The best thing you can ever hope to ever get is a contested estate. Because all the family dirty laundry comes out in a contested estate. I had that happen in my first book, and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm reading this. This is like all the family's dirty laundry in, I don't say dirty laundry, but it was like the inner workings of a family unfolding in court in a way we would just never know otherwise. And you couldn't know. So you have to really be dogged in searching down these bits and pieces. And government records are important, looking for consistencies in government records. And then kind of like, at some point, you'd also have to accept that there's only so much you're going to know. And then you have to infer. So.
Thank you. Next question. When Big Jim passed, what sort of funeral did he have? Such an important New Orleans figure and culture bearer must have had an extravagant send-off.
Again, I do not know. I know he had a very big and very loving write-up, a very long obituary in the newspaper, and I can't speak to the send-off, but I can say that politicians of a variety of different backgrounds, sent in, their paragraph into the obituary, and, like, our condolences to the family. I mean, Kaminsky was very well known and very highly regarded in political circles. Again, like talking to Jimmy Fitzmaurice, I guess I interviewed him in 2013, he certainly had tons of respect many years later for Comiskey. So.
Thank you. I think after looking through a lot of this is a lot of comments. So I think there's only one question that I see that's remaining. Okay. Let me sift through it. It's just a whole bunch of comments. I so appreciate the Comiskey family for joining us. You all are in full effect, and we are appreciative of your presence. So thank you, and thank you for answering the question. Jim Comiskey had 4 children, and thank you for all of the clarification. We so enjoyed it. This was awesome.
Yeah, okay. I don't have the comments on, but I definitely want to go read them and follow up on them. Yeah.
Did the whiskey stop at the 5-year grade?
No, it was 6. It was a 6-year whiskey when it ceased production. Okay. That I do know.
And so all of these are recorded. We would like to thank you all for joining us. I think that is the end of our questions. But yes, the recording will be made available on our website. And we will also send out a post event evaluation to you all, which would have more information about when this recording will be available.
Well, I'm very gratified, in particular, the family members who've come, and maybe one day when we can socially undistance, we could all like have a big drink or something. That would be fun. I'd love to learn more. Learn more. It's one of those things when you write history, and you know, one of the reasons why I like doing interviews is you do get to get the participant's point of view, but that's not always possible. So it's exciting when it's possible. So.
Thank you all so much. And I want to say that our website address is Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. So hggh.org. And you will also be hearing from us fairly soon regarding an evaluation of this program. So please give us your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. So I would like to thank you, Dr. Nistrom, for joining us and imparting so much rich information. And the pressure was on because you had the family members, but you did an amazing job. I learned so much about that time period in New Orleans. Everything was amazing. I did not know Schwagman's was giving out shots.
Well, inexpensive for sure. Yeah.
Food samples for sure. But we would like to thank you all for joining us. Again, just check our website, hggh.org, for updates, including when this recording will be up, and also look for that email from us to evaluate this program. Look forward to hearing from you all, and have a good night.